Well, our subject today has been internal colonialism. And I think all of the papers have, in one way or another, addressed this phenomenon. Osama brought up, the issue of whether we can see the Ottoman state as colonial, or I think, put it differently, that we ought to be able to see it as colonial. I think that's right, although, of course, from a pan-Islamic point of view, there's objections to depicting it in that way. But even, all of these identities are fluid and we're always somewhat in flux. Even things like, well, the question of who is an Armenian, because there were purely Turkish-speaking Armenians. So then they would be identified by the church and not by the language. But then we only have one of the markers of identity rather than two or three. Of course, when they had the population exchange with Greece, a lot of people were very unhappy and disoriented because it was done by religion, and they were Turkish-speaking Orthodox who suddenly were wandering the streets of Athens and really didn't know their way. It was a foreign country to them. So these identities are somewhat fluid, not only the identities of the subjects of the state, but also that of the state itself. One of the things that I came away from these papers contemplating was the question of whether we really should be reifying even what looks like a strong bureaucratic state like the Ottoman Empire as a state through time. Because I think, in the very early 19th century, well, the Tunisians, for instance, were supposedly a vassal state, but they didn't say right to Istanbul for a long time. Part of what the Tanzimat is, and is not usually depicted in this way, I think, but it was a bank robbery. It was an attempt to shake down the derebays and provinces to realize a revenue stream that wasn't being realized. But that tells you also how weak the pre-Tanzimat state was, that it was giving up these revenues to local elites and not because it wanted to. So is that a state in the way that we think about states? What did it really do as a state for people? How much infrastructure did it provide? And so forth. So I think both the center and the subjects, and I suppose after the Treaty of Paris, we can maybe start to talk about Osmanluluk and citizens, but both are in flux with regard to their identity, with regard to their habitus, their everyday practices, and these are changing radically. I mean, again, one of the things I take away from the papers that have been presented here is this Foucauldian rupture we see in the very late 19th century. I mean, there had been always revolts and state responses which took the form of massacres. But as Javad was saying, I think the scale on which we see these things increases enormously as you get into the 1890s and into the early 20th century. Part of that change is a more efficient state, a more thorough bureaucracy, and we see with Tazel's work, even to the point of documenting the emigres in a very specific way. Part of the change seems to me almost certainly technological. The Ottomans, however they may have failed to meet modernity in many ways, had their eye on those German weapons. And they imported them, and they surprised the British during World War I with how good they were and how modern their weaponry was. And that was why Churchill couldn't take Gallipoli. But in the same way that you could use that modern weaponry, Gatling guns and so forth, against an invader, you could also use them against the subjects. And in some ways, you know, the Ottoman Empire didn't pioneer this. The Germans used Gatling guns on the Namibians, and it was one of the first big modern semi-genocides. I mean, the numbers weren't like the later genocides, but the technique of just mowing people down with this modern technology was similar to what you saw later. And I think you begin to see this. You think about the technologies of the Armenian genocide, bureaucracy, modern weaponry, a highly reorganized military on the Prussian style. All of those elements of what we might think of modernity get used then for this purpose of reshaping the demography of the empire. And so what could be more colonial than that? In essence, the Ottoman citizens all become Namibians from this point of view. The elites in Istanbul are using their new levers of power, bureaucratic and technological, to shape the empire in a massive way. So, you know, I would maintain that in the old days, say before 1850 or so, if the Kurds revolt or gave trouble, they would send some troops out and deal with them. And the way it would be ended was that the Kurds would agree to pay taxes that year. No guarantees about the next year, but that would be, it would be performative in some sense. The conflict between the subjects and the state, and especially the subjects that were far away from the state. Or as several of the presenters said, one way of dealing with these things, which was common in the Ottoman Empire, was common in Qajar Iran, where they didn't want to expend the wealth and the effort, the blood and treasure of subduing challengers in the provinces, that they would find out who their enemy was and give them some gold and set them against them. Which is why I was suggesting that this dialectic of fitna and nizam kind of went together throughout this period. And that breaks down, I would argue, in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, where fitna is no longer dealt with in these light ways, in these performative ways of demanding at least temporary submission, demanding at least temporary payment of taxes, but where then challengers were simply mown down, were removed where they were inconvenient, or encouraged to immigrate. Put enough pressure on people at a time in the early 20th century when capitalist labor flows transglobally were quite large. It was foreseeable that if you put a lot of pressure on certain groups, that you could maybe encourage them right out of the country. And I think that was part of what was going on. And so, if we start to think about the internal colonialism of the late Ottoman state, I think we have to see a major change in the technologies of control. Though that change produces these tragedies which are at the foundation of state formation in the subsequent region. So I think I've put some things on the plate here, and we should open it up for other people's final contemplations on this subject.
So is it all open to us? Or
Yes.
do you want the presenters to do this?
I think that the presenters get first dibs.
Okay.
I will start with the technology of control. I think that's a kind of the most sophisticated way to describe the late Ottoman colonialism or eternal colonialism in regarding technology of control. And in my book manuscript in chapter 5, I describe this telegraph as a technology of control because in Ottoman Kurdistan, at least, unlike the other regions, there was no technology of transportation. So, and in Western Anatolia, in Southern Anatolia, in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, there was railway in Kilikya, but there's no railway in Kurdistan or in Western Armenia. But there is a very well-functioning telegraph line. And that creates a differential form of control and surveillance practice of the empire. So there's no mobility or integration in terms of like mobility of army fast in terms of railway or integration to global market economy in terms of moving grain or other valuable commercial items to other parts of the world. But you can have the information what is going on in the region, why they like almost in every day. And when you look at the number of telegraph stations, the year around, like in 1860s, it was only connected to Diyarbakir and Erzurum. But by mid-1890s, you see that it is almost every district of Ottoman Kurdistan has a telegraph station. And that creates a really distinct form of surveillance and control of Ottoman state over the region. That's why I was telling Hazal's like the mobility of people, because so they were very strict about recording, taking the pictures of who left, because they already knew that they left. So the Hamidian government really had that control mechanism. So I was even kind of saying like they use telegraph almost like a Twitter line. Yeah, it is. So the circulation of knowledge is extremely high, as Bahadur Chalebi wrote in his dissertation. It's just really, really high.
If I use my prerogative here, chairing this session, I would just say two things in response. It's an excellent observation and very important. One is that the British lobbied for those telegraph lines.
Yes, they did.
Because they used them to spy on India.
Yes, like actually the telegraph engineer who established the line in Diyarbakir, he used Diyarbakir fortress to wire the line in 1860. Yes, the British, yeah,
Yes,
the connection to India.
So in a way, the Ottoman use of this was subsidiary to the British capitalist colonialist use of it in Asia. The other thing to say, though, is that one of the unexpected outcomes of wiring Iran with telegraph was that it enabled the 1892 tobacco revolt, because it turns out people can send telegraphs, not just the government. And so, whereas Iran has this problem, it doesn't have big rivers, it didn't have railway until the 20s. And so the only way that people in Shiraz could coordinate with Isfahan and Mashhad was these telegraph lines. But they were able to make the first modern nationalist revolt against the incursion of British capitalism in the form of the tobacco regime with the demonic use of the telegraph. I wonder if anything like that happened it was 1908, people were able to use telegraph?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, because the Young Turk Revolution would not have been possible without the weaponization of the telegraph line, because what happened was that even though they say there was a handful of young Turks, most of them in the Balkans, of course. They nevertheless, and Talat Pasha himself was, of course, a telegraph official, so that they were very aware of that. And before that, when the Young Turk resistance started building in the Ottoman Empire, they used those telegraphs initially, and they gave telegraphs to all the governors and to the sort of the responsible secretaries of the Union and Progress, so that when the revolution started, so to speak, they were told from Paris through Meshveret to actually start sending telegraphs to Abdülhamid, so that he became under the illusion that this was not like a group of people focusing on the Balkans, but rather this was an empire-wide uprising, and that's exactly how they were able to. I mean, that's why he gave in so quickly, they say, and telegraph was also weaponized by the British during the Lausanne Treaty negotiations, when Lord Curzon in his memoir said that carrying the negotiations was like playing bridge when you can see the hands of everybody else, because of course the Turkish delegation corresponded with Ankara, and the British controlled the telegraph and a full sort of narrative of whatever they were talking about, which didn't help.
Well, it's just a sign that all technologies are double-edged swords.
Oh, yeah.
Halil Analgic pointed out that the advent of gunpowder allowed the states to deploy artillery for the first time to create order in their realms. But then it also allowed the development of handheld weapons, which were used then in the Jalali revolt. And so
Exactly, yeah.
it's always a double-edged sword.
Just, I think, very quick note, I think Talat Pasha has a special telegraph station in his office. If I am
his
not
house,
in his house, I think in the, I read in the Kaiser's recent book, the Talat Pasha, the father of modern Turkey. I think that's what his house, not his office.
The house,
Yeah, his in his house, yeah.
Well, building on this, what I call technologies of power in making colonialism or internal colonialism possible, I, of course, in my research, do not limit. I start with the late Ottoman period, but go into the Republican period, where in 1931, the Chief of General Staff, Fredrik Çakmak, writes that the Ottoman government started building a road across Dersim back in 1850s, and it's only now that we completed the road, which allowed us to bring the government's inspiring weapons to Dersim, and the people were shocked when they saw these big machines. And this is, and then in 1934, the railway arrives in Dersim, near Dersim basically, and they write a book about Dersim. The Turkish journal is called Dersim. It's a 300 pages secret book. They built bridges, and so this knowledge production and the advancements in technology go hand in hand, and they have always referred back to the Ottoman period. They did not see any, unlike the kind of official narrative of the Republic, which argued that that was a new regime and everything was exact opposite of what the Ottomans meant. In their internal writings, at least in the case of Dersim, they did not see any difference between the Ottoman policies in the region and the one in the Republic. They basically said, this is a problem that the Ottoman government started to deal with, and it's up to us to finish this. This, they never questioned that.
So Kemalism was the last of the Tanzimat reforms.
I mean, from that's kind of my dissertation, and
or Erdogan's one. That would be interesting.
And yeah, that goes on from then
You see
building the dams, burning the forests, those kind of practices started actually with the Keban Dam in near there. And maybe just to, add another dimension to the discussion, we put basically the word internal into quotation marks for a reason that I thought maybe we can talk about a little more. As soon as we call it internal, then to me it seemed like we assume there are boundaries, natural kind of boundaries, borders of states. And to me, this idea of colonialism, whether it's what is internal, what is external, it's an interesting dynamic because from the perspective of the Kurds, Armenians, or people who were not in the position of power, being internal and external meant something else than people in Istanbul who were in charge of, it considered them as sovereigns. And that becomes even more complicated in the case of French Algeria as opposed to British India, where one claims that these are our part of the homeland, in Algeria being part of the French homeland, whereas in the British case it's quite different. So and this idea of internal colonialism apparently was started in the US academia in 1950s and 60s, but in reference to race and class and underdevelopment of certain groups, and then it seems to have hit a dead end from that. So I wonder how we can bring these different interpretations of internal colonialism or colonialism per se into the same bracket and understand this as a global phenomenon that is not exclusive to external colonialism, or external colonialism is not independent of internal colonialism. But I wonder what other people think of it.
And I think markers like internal and external is like even more maybe like insufficient and underwhelming when we think about late 19th century when people were like suddenly really mobile. We talk about like how people immigrate, how people and goods flow really quickly. And so like especially when I think about like Armenian women coming from Sivas to Trabzon, going to Marseille, and then coming to Ellis Island, and then going to somewhere in the US. I think about like how mobile they were and how we are trapped in our methodological nationalism. Like even we try to go out of it, we're still there, we're still in the boundaries of the nation state. And I think photography is an interesting technology of the time in terms of arriving anywhere in the world nearly at the same time. Like we talk about like how things arrive late in our part of the world in general, like telegraph or transportation systems, but photography was celebrated as a more like democratic technology, which can talk about it until morning. But the interesting thing was like it was taken in the Ottoman Empire so quickly after its founding in 1839, and I like fascinated to see like documents in the Ottoman State Archives about like, how different like police centers in like Kayseri, Adana, Trabzon, like anywhere, requested cameras from Istanbul. They wanted it themselves. They said, we want to document. So it is a really interesting and fascinating technology that's like captured people's minds.
Well, just to sort of, you're asking the question, how can we
talk about internal colonialism, at least in this context? I think probably using intersectionality as the framework would be a way to do it. And I think with respect to any technology, including, for example, the telegraph, if you intersect it with power and who had access to power, and especially how the state would try to monopolize power, then weaponize technology. That may be one way of doing it. And then if you then look at various communities living in the Ottoman Empire, you know, how much they were willing, able to share in that power, has also a way. And in a way, then you have Uğur Ümit using photography to document his hegemony and rule all over, in a way. And at the same time, of course, the different minorities are using, you know, pictures as a way to document the violence against them. So it's used, I think, it depends, as I said, what the intent of the photographer is on the one side, and how it impacts the communities, I think, in terms of power on the other. And that is probably why Dersim doesn't have railroads. That's a very good question, because telegraphy comes, I think, into the Ottoman Empire through surveillance and control, mostly, or it gets co-opted by the state, so that there is some private telegraph companies initially that belong to Western Europeans, but I think it becomes monopolized very quickly. Whereas if you look at the railroads, they first become, the first one is in the Aegean region for trade reasons, to tie the hinterland to the port cities. So that's a different one. And of course, railroads enable, they carry people, and therefore it's not monopolized and like telegraphs could be by the state as such. So that may be another reason.
Yeah, the Ottomans saw
Yes.
the Eastern Anatolia and the reaches of Iran and Iraq as dangerous places.
Mhm.
So one of the
Yeah.
problems you have if you build a rail link between Istanbul and Tabriz is that the Tabrizis can get on it, and you may not want that. There's a, when you're talking about photographs, also and internal colonialism, and one of Osama's comments reminded me of this. I once had a free day in Istanbul, and I went to the Dolmabahce Palace, and I was interested in the paintings on the walls, which were French Orientalists depicting Algerian tribes. And it was very clear that this was Imperial Ottoman Orientalism, actually borrowing the techniques of European, painting and depictions, but for the purpose of kind of romanticizing, but also deprecating the Arabic-speaking populations of the empire as feckless Bedouin and maybe a little bit dangerous and so forth. But it seemed to me that somebody should write a book about those paintings, because they were commissioned and they're on the palace wall for a reason. But it's really Ottoman colonialism.
Well, that concept of Ottoman colonialism is a very recent one. That's Selim Derengil and others sort of have started. Hans Jensen is another one who started working on it. But that's a great idea. I have never thought of the ones there.
I think we
And
have
there's
one of the earliest.
And then we have
Exactly.
some again.
And there are Orientalist photography collections, for example, Elbise Osmani of Pascal Sabah and
How can I forget the name of the painter? Osman Hamdi. Yeah, Osman Hamdi Bey and Pascal Sabah at Elbise Osmani collection, where they travel to provinces and photograph people in their authentic, they would say, clothes.
I just want to make a comment. I think one of the points that became so evident in today's interventions is the necessity to, and going back to Javan's point about the internal and the external, is the importance of continuing doing the kind of research that brings out the subtleties and connections, solidarities and resistance between people. And yes, I agree. And not only that we have methodological nationalism. I mean, in many ways, I mean, the very name, the very term Middle East, right, is in itself very problematic. But also empire-centered and state-centered, and we keep grappling in. I do that. I do the same.
It's the British Navy,
What?
It was the British Navy.
They're the culprits.
The British Navy invented the term Middle East.
Oh, yes,
really?
yes,
That's-
yeah.
It's the east you go through to get to the Far East, to India.
Yeah, it's from Europe, I knew that. I didn't-
He was echoing. But
Yeah,
the British office
It's a pretty farming label in 19.
But he was also Navy.
But he had another idea of what the Middle East is and from where to where it stretches.
This really, these divisions reasserts the fact that some of the questions that Usama raised today, where we do not think about the Levant or the Arab Mashriq in connection to Anatolia, in connection to the Balkans, and there are so many. I mean, how did the Arabs, if any, represented knew about the Adana massacres? What was happening in the Arab provinces during the genocide? What happened to the Arabs, to the Armenians who ended up in Syria in the long term, for example? All of these questions are extremely important. But I think mapping solidarities and mapping patterns of resistance, I think, is a way to bring us out of that fixation of the nation state and the empire and colonization that we as if we don't know enough what colonization or how the state functions anyway. But I think we have enough. What we don't have enough is the patterns of solidarity. And I think it became so apparent in the kind of micro studies of each of the papers and the subtleties they brought up. But I think we all need to take that work a step forward and start asking different kind of questions. So I just wanted to share this thought with everyone.
Yeah.
Can I just add one quick footnote to this? I mean, I appreciate this as patterns of solidarity. Just wanted to quickly remark on the liberal ways in which we have been throwing around the word Balkans today. Like that is, as Maria told Robert, never wrote, right? We're back. So I just wanted to, and it reminded me of a saying from a geographical work from the 1950s, I think, that you're always somebody else's Balkan.
Yeah.
Osama is in the queue.
I don't think it was fair to sides oriented.
No, I have a, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, so.
I think it's not on.
It's not on?
It seemed to be.
All right, anyway. Yeah, this has been an incredibly, I'm not going to use the buzzwords, but it's a wonderful conference or workshop today. So thank you to all the papers. Honestly, maybe because of COVID, I just don't remember like a set of papers that have been as excellent as today's papers. I wish I had learned this before I wrote my book, frankly. But the question, to go back to Shabbat's point, you can just get rid of the word internal. Just put colonialism, modern state and colonialism, and that solves the issue. But I think that the real question is, can we study the nuances and intricacies that Hakan was talking about, and how do we do so? But I think the precondition of any of this research or any of these interventions has to be a lack of defensiveness. And this is the most critical and crucial aspect. The precondition to any kind of research is to sort of say, to admit that there are these issues to begin with, and then from there, that allows for a certain, because I don't think, this goes back to the question of colonialism and the fact of Orientalism and the fact that we live and work and produce in a field of knowledge that has been dominated overwhelmingly by a certain group and the heirs of that group. And so I think, it's I think these being honest and being forthright about where we're coming from, and how we write and the quality of not just the expression of solidarity, but the quality of solidarity. Solidarity is a term we all use. What does it actually mean when push comes to shove? So I'm a little bit more skeptical about saying we should think outside of the nation, and of course we should, but the point is we're bound by these nation states, whether we like it or not. We're talking about how people get denaturalized. I mean, the point is we have to live within certain states, and as much as we want to get beyond it, getting beyond it, I think we can get beyond it and at the same time acknowledge the profound presence of these formations and their historicity. So, but I think the last point I would make, just in terms of thanking Javad and everyone else, is this idea of working without defensiveness. Because to me, especially on the question of minorities, especially on the question of massacres, especially on the question, all these questions, you cannot possibly narrate these things from a defensive standpoint. And I think that's what's haunted the field more so than anything else.
And the Michigan way is we try to go beyond them. If I may be very proud of our center in American Studies, center here and others, I think. Good. I think they are beyond.
But there are also, we should not forget, there is the price to call colonialism in the context of the peace in Turkey. Years ago, when Ismail Beşikçi, sociologist, said Kurdistan is Turkey's internal colonialism, he was imprisoned for a couple of decades. So there are consequences of this terminology, actually, or the price to be paid. And I think, and that might actually bring us to naturalize the citizen. So it's really kind of the idea is there, but the ways in which we use terms and or how we sophisticate them and how we represent and call them is really kind of the cost could be really, the stake might be high, especially these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing no, you go ahead.
Go ahead.
I like this idea that Hakan put forward of solidarities, and I do think that it's important for us to think about solidarities and how does the idea of solidarity center or decenter the notion of colonialism. But I, as an ethnographer, since I have this sensibility, I think sometimes it's also interesting or good to just be comfortable with the tensions, be comfortable with when it's solidarity and when it's not at the same time. And I think one of the greatest examples that I can give is that during the 2019-2020 protests in Beirut, you would have people going and they would be shouting, "Isqat al-Nizam al-Taifi," let go down with the sectarian regime. But when they would speak to each other, and when my friends would try to show me who came, they would say, these people there are Christians. And I said, how do you know there are Christians? And like they have a proper behavior. So for me it's like, how can you say such a thing? But then I moved a step forward and I say, okay, let's see, what can I do with these tensions? What can I do when it is solidarity and at the same time it's not solidarity?
Yeah.
How I can work with the tensions on the ground.
Well,
I was going to say that if you look at the staff of the US military and bureaucracy in the Philippines, when they invaded and occupied, and some of it was disease, but altogether they were responsible for about 400,000 deaths in the early 20th century. The US. A lot of them had seen action in Arizona. They had colonized the Navajo and the Mexicans, and then they went across the Pacific to colonize the Philippines. So there's a direct relationship in personnel.
actually, in between that, Muhammad Ali also, of Egypt,
Yeah.
would use those to sort of aggress upon the Sudanese, I guess, right?
Yes,
Down-
yes. Well, that's another thing, is that a lot of this phenomenon is layered in the
Layered,
Ottoman Empire.
exactly.
So when the Egyptians invade Sudan and they start planting cotton plantations down there and exploiting its resources, a lot of the personnel involved are Ottomans. And some of the documentation was in Ottoman. So here's what are you going to call it in the 19th century? We now say it's an Arab vassal state of the Ottomans, but he was Albanian, and a lot of his officers were still Ottomans, and a lot of the records for the Muhammad Ali period, if you go in the Egyptian archives and try to work on that period, the Ottoman documents come out, and then a lot of times the local clerks have made Arabic transliterations for the MA students who don't know Ottoman. So is Sudan being colonized by Cairo or by Istanbul? I mean, in a way, it's both.
Or by the West.
Well, in the West, why are you planting cotton?
Yes, exactly.
And to add to that US experience, I think we were talking with Professor Göçek, how all the key government authorities involved in their massacres were earlier involved in other cases of massacres against other groups, Armenians.
Yeah,
The
Celal
Greeks,
Bayar and
etc.
Şükrü Kaya being two examples. For example, Celal Bayar was from Bursa, and he's one of the few civilian members of the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusat, the special organization. And then he first goes to the Aegean region, trying to, and starts clandestine violence against the Greeks there, the Greek room, to get them to leave for, of course, Greece. And then it is because of his experience there that he is later, of course, becomes a statesperson. And it is no accident that it was during his time we had the 6-7 September 1955 pogroms. So there are all these continuities in violence. Şükrü Kaya likewise is initially appointed the sort of, let's say, the commission over resettlement of the Armenians, so to speak. And it wasn't, of course, a resettlement, it was a massacre. But nevertheless, that was what he first experienced. And then he then became, of course, used the same thing against the Kurds later on, and then became the interior minister of the Turkish Republic. I mean, you know, if you don't see the continuity of violence there, I don't know where else that happens, yeah.
It's like Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh. Yep.
Well, we are 3 minutes past our time,
Mhm.
but I think we have well and truly feasted at this rich repast that our conference attendees have given us. And thank you all very much. Thank you for inviting me to preside over this last session.
Thank you.
Thanks.